So I'm delighted now to introduce today's speaker. Rev Dr Martin Hobgen is a Baptist minister who has recently completed his doctoral studies at Northern Baptist College. Martin's seeking to find ways to enable physically disabled people to become fully involved in the life of Baptist church communities. He is contributing a chapter on the intersectionality of disability and being Baptist for a forthcoming book on Baptist identity, as well as rewriting his thesis for publication. Martin is also engaged with churches, associations and colleges through his work in the Baptist Union Disability Hub. Currently living in Northamptonshire, he's about to move imminently to take up the pastorate of Swaveling Baptist Church, Southampton, next month, and we're particularly grateful to him for agreeing to speak to us today at this time of transition. So we welcome Martin now to speak with the title, Disability, Friendship and Baptists. Thank you, Martin.
Thank you. Sorry, thank you very much, Chris. I'm staring at the camera, but I'm also reading my paper, so I can't see you, but you can see me. As Chris has indicated, I recently finished my PhD last year and have contributed a chapter to this book on Baptist intersectionality. And this paper draws very heavily on that chapter and has drawn some other information in from my thesis. Mark Medley suggests that tradition provides a communal space in which people can dwell and a set of practices that shapes how participants live a way of life. The experience of many disabled people, however, is that of exclusion from such communal space, or being passive observers rather than active participants. So this paper will examine how disabled people were isolated from society and church from the early 18th century to the late 20th. The significant change from a medical to a social understanding of disability in the late 20th century is identified. This change, however, left relationships between disabled and non-disabled people in generalized terms. I will be drawing on Porphyris's pastoral doctrine of the Trinity and Baptist understandings of covenant community for this paper to argue that covenant friendships of a particular kind are a significant way to foster the participatory inclusion of disabled people in Baptist church communities. I won't be exploring theologies of disability in detail, but I will give a brief overview of some key approaches by a selection of authors. The forthcoming book that's been mentioned explores Baptist intersectionality, yet disability is also intersectional, as illustrated by my experience of both. I write not only from the perspective of being a disabled person, but as an Anglo-Saxon male, an ordained Baptist minister, a wheelchair user, brought up in a lower middle class family context, who is well educated in mainstream schools, experienced a variety of forms of employment, married but without children. My perspective would be significantly altered if any of those intersectionalities were different. My experience of being disabled is in itself shaped by a number of intersectionalities, those identified above, and the fact that I have a medical condition which created a congenital impairment, resulting in me being a full-time wheelchair user from the age of 8. Although I am paralyzed from the waist down, the use of my arms and upper body and intellect are unaffected. Again, my experiences of disability, therefore, are shaped by these embodied constraints rather than any intellectual or other hidden disabilities. There is some noise in the background, Chris. I don't know if somebody's not muted. The disability rights activist Vic Finkelstein identified that prior to the Industrial Revolution, disabled people largely lived with their families, neighbours and friends in local communities, which were predominantly rural. He refers to this as phase 1 of 3. During the 18th century, rapid industrialization alongside medicalization and institutionalization meant that disabled people were increasingly isolated from society, and disability was understood to arise from the individual in terms of their medical condition. This approach dominated the understanding of disability until the late 20th century, during the period which Finkelstein refers to as Phase 2. This understanding of disability and disabled people has come to be known as the medical model of disability, sometimes referred to as the individual medical model. In 1976, the World Health Organization produced the following definitions that describe this understanding of disability and who disabled people are. An impairment is any loss or abnormality of psychological, physiological, or anatomic structure or function. Disability is any restriction or lack resulting from an impairment of an ability to perform an activity in the manner or within the range considered normal for a human being. Handicap is a disadvantage for an individual resulting from an impairment or disability that limits or prevents the fulfillment of a role, depending on age, sex, social class, and cultural factors, for that individual. This set of definitions was intended to address loss or abnormality due to impairments. These impairments are measured by a medical diagnosis concerning psychological, physiological, or anatomical features or functions. Disability is then defined as a direct result from impairment and is seen in terms of inability to perform various activities. The problematic term handicap then defines any disadvantage that a disabled person experiences as being due to inability to fulfill a role that society assumes to be normal for all human beings. It is this explicit focus on the individual and their impairment from which disability and handicap are assumed to arise, which led to the naming of this definition as the individual medical model. This understanding of disability has implications for the role of disabled people in churches in general. The so-called problem of disability is located with individuals and their impairments. The medical profession held power over disabled people, their treatment, and many aspects of their lives in asymmetric relationships. Disabled people were often institutionalized in workhouses and other institutions, subsequently becoming the objects of charitable giving. The intersectional nature of the experience of disability during this period has, however, largely been overlooked until very recently. There was a wide range of non-medical issues which informed the experience of disability during this time. Issues such as gender, class, and race intersect with disability in ways that can both exacerbate or ameliorate the relationship between disabled and non-disabled people. Unlike race, class, and gender, the solution has historically been to rehabilitate disabled people so that they are normalized, enabling them to fit and to live within mainstream non-disabled society. This approach has subsequently shaped the Church's understanding of disability and the relationship with disabled people in ways which have hindered inclusion. During this period, churches became significant providers of care and support to various groups, sometimes through the provision of institutional care. The institutional context of disabled people led to highly asymmetric relationships between disabled residents and non-disabled staff, perceived as helped and helper. The American theologian and disability rights campaigner Nancy Iceland has identified a number of ways in which the individual medical model has resulted in the exclusion of disabled people from churches. The association of disability with sin or virtuous suffering, assuming disabled people are in need of charity, problematic readings of healing miracles and other passages, the unintentional and intentional exclusion of disabled people physically, socially, and theologically, and the silencing or ignoring of the voices of disabled people. Recent research has shown how the individual medical model has led to an impoverished pastoral care model of disability, which views disabled people as passive recipients. Naomi Jacobs argues that the misuse of pastoral power has been the key to churches' pastoral care of disabled people, which has often been expressed in terms of charity. She argues that as a result, I quote, most theology of disability remains rooted in pastoral theology. I strongly suggest that the problem is not that theologies of disability are rooted in pastoral theology itself, but that an inappropriate pastoral care model of disability is rooted in narrow and impoverished parodies of pastoral theology. These parodies sustain problematic assumptions about disabilities linked to sin, requiring forgiveness, and to illness, requiring healing. Jacobs argues correctly, I think, that such a skewed approach in both pastoral care and theology leads to the othering of disabled people. This reinforces the doing for relationship between disabled and non-disabled people, which denies disabled people agency, silences their voices, and can lead to segregated patterns of ministry. This restricts the possibility of the formation of meaningful relationships between disabled and non-disabled people in church communities. There was a very significant change in the understanding of disability during the last 3 decades of the 20th century, phase 3 of Finkelstein's framework. This has a profound effect on relationships between disabled people and society, dominated by non-disabled people. Disability activists and disabled academics developed the social model of disability in the 1970s and 80s. It is rooted within what was at the time the newly emerging field of disability sociology, together with a growing disability rights movement. From these arose a 2-stage definition of impairment and disability. Impairment is seen as lacking part or all of a limb or having a defective limb, organ or mechanism in the body or other non-physical aspects of an impairment. And disability is the disadvantage or restriction of activity caused by a contemporary social organization which takes no or little account of people who have physical impairment or other impairments, and thus excludes them from participation in the mainstream of social activities. In light of this, disability has been described by the Union of the Physically Impaired Against Segregation in the following way. It is society which disables physically impaired people. Disability is something imposed on top of our impairments. By the way, we are unnecessarily isolated and excluded from full participation in society. Disabled people are therefore an oppressed group. Note the use of the phrase our impairments, revealing disabled people talking about their experience rather than being discussed by non-disabled people. The social model was deliberately intended to break the link between the individual who lives with some level of impairment and their experience of disability, which is the result of the attitudes and actions of others towards them by people or groups, organizations, and society. Rather than expecting disabled people to change, be cured or healed in order to be included in all aspects of society, this model emphasizes the need for social attitudes towards disabled people to change. This results in actions being taken by society that enable disabled people to be included. These necessary actions may range from physical access, for example, the provision of equipment such as wheelchairs, ramped access, hearing aids, and loops, to the social, political, and economic changes required for disabled people to actively participate rather than passively observe. The social model activity utilized by disability rights campaigners eventually led to anti-discrimination legislation in the form of the Disability Discrimination Act 1995, incorporated into the Equality Act in 2010. For churches, the social model moves the focus to emphasize on relationships between church communities and disabled people within and beyond the local church. This has resulted in a significant improvement to the physical access and facilities of many churches. By focusing so much on attitudes and barrier removal, however, it has done little to facilitate development of inclusive and empowering relationships between disabled and non-disabled people. These relationships remain at a generalized level between two groups described as the disabled and the able-bodied, with a lack of mutual relationships between them. I suggest that what is needed is a shift away from non-disabled people doing things for disabled people towards a shift towards being with one another, as proposed by Sam Wells in the Nazareth Manifesto. The social model of disability provides a significant shift from the former to the latter. It is worth noting that although writers in the US often use the term social model of disability, there are many occasions when the model that is being used is actually the minority group model of disability. Within this model, disabled people are understood to be a group of people who, because of their physical or cultural characteristics, are singled out from the others in the society in which they live for differential and unequal treatment, and who therefore regard themselves as objects of collective discrimination. This approach has achieved significant improvement to the inclusion of disabled people in the US and has led to an anti-discrimination legislation across the US as well. Its major weakness, however, is the necessary maintenance of two distinct groups, the disabled and the able-bodied. This restricts the potential for truly mutual and inclusive relationships between disabled and non-disabled people. A brief overview of disability theology. The nature of disability has been discussed within various aspects of theology for many years, surveyed in the book Disability in the Christian Tradition, edited by Brian Brock and John Swinton. Despite disability being a recurrent theme in the Bible, this has only been addressed at the end of the 20th and into the early 21st centuries in a coherent way. It was the publication of Nancy Eiesland's The Disabled God in 1994 that marked the emergence of a coherent body of theological exploration, described as a theology of disability or disability theology. Professor John Swinton suggests that disability theology is the attempt by disabled and non-disabled Christians to understand and interpret the gospel of Jesus Christ, God, and humanity against the backdrop of the historical and contemporary experiences of people with disabilities. It has come to refer to a variety of perspectives and methods designed to give voice to the rich and diverse theological means of the human experience of disability. The first coherent work on disability theology was done with regards to people with learning disabilities. The most significantly known authors include Stanley Hauerwas, the late Jean Vanier, Conwy Nguyen, and more recently Hans Reinders and John Swinton. Theological reflection on the experiences of physically disabled people has only really developed into a significant strand of theology since the publication of the already mentioned Nancy Eiesland's book in 1994. Professor John Hull, writing in the slim volume Disability, the Inclusive Church Resource, provides a helpful approach to understanding the relationships between disability theology and the wider theological context. He proposes a map of branches, genres, and frontiers. Hull's approach is vital to avoid the risk of either pigeonholing disability theology within one aspect of theological reflection and exploration, or dissecting disability theology into distinct sections which become isolated from one another and the whole. I want to briefly outline approaches to understanding disability that are found within the ever-growing body of work within disability theology. A brief word about Nancy Eiesland's The Disabled God, Kathy Black's The Healing Homiletic, Jenny Block's Copious Hosting, Tom Reynolds' Vulnerable Communion, and Deborah Beth Creamer's Disability and Christian Theology. Nancy Iceland focuses attention on the marks of crucifixion that Jesus' resurrection body retains. This leads to a radical inclusion of disabled people within church communities that enables their voice to be heard and their participation to be facilitated. She uses the minority group model of disability and takes a liberation theology approach. Iceland identifies and addresses the following issues: the association of disability with sin or virtuous suffering, assuming that disabled people are in need of charity, problematic readings of the miracles and other passages in Scripture, unintentional and intentional exclusion of disabled people in various ways, and the ignoring of the voices of disabled people. Kathy Black's healing homiletic addresses the interpretation of some of the healing miracle passages in the Gospels. She seeks to show how these do not infer that disabled people require physical healing as a prerequisite for inclusion in church communities. This approach is underpinned by the notion of interdependency. Black emphasizes the importance of our interdependence on God and one another. She does not, however, develop this idea as fully as she might. She rightly rejects any notion of an all-powerful God as the cause of disability, but does not fully develop an alternative, more relational Trinitarian perspective. She does helpfully call for both disabled and non-disabled people to be agents of healing with one another, but the nature of the relationship between them remains vague and generalized. In Copious Hosting, Jenny Block understands the church as a hospitable community which, however, has not been inclusive of disabled people. She notes three particular forms of oppression: by non-disabled people, by language, and by low expectations. Her approach is productive in a number of ways, namely the relational nature of humanity, the significance of the Trinity in fostering the idea of co-hosts, and each person in a community being in truly mutual relationships where all participants both give and receive. So she suggests that the idea of being co-hosts with Jesus Christ, such that all people are included in church communities through mutual relationships with God and with one another. In his book, Vulnerable Communion, Tom Reynolds attempts to identify the complex nature of factors which shape contemporary theological perspectives on disability. He develops the idea of body capital, shaped by economic forces, which values non-disabled people but devalues disabled people. He suggests that it is important to shift from viewing disability as an inevitable tragedy to an acceptance of the transformative impact that social relationships can have on the inclusion of disabled people. In order to achieve this, it will be necessary to challenge the idea that normal equals able. This idea, he suggests, gave rise to a cult of normalcy. The complex understanding of disability is reflected in his definition of disability as a range of physiologically rooted social performances, a series of moments defined by relationships between human beings. The distinction between ability and disability is built into the fabric of communal life. In seeking to challenge the dominance of self-interest, usually benefiting non-disabled people, Reynolds examines the significance of weakness and vulnerability in seeking the positive value of community as a way to strengthen relationships with one another and God. Proper recognition of interdependency, Reynolds suggests, is a better reflection of how God enables us to participate in faith communities as a matter of grace rather than ability. He advocates privileging disabled people, believing that this will enable both disabled and non-disabled people to recognize their shared experience as vulnerable human beings. In her book, Disability in the Christian Tradition, Beth Creamer focuses attention on the limits that are common to all people created in God's image. She argues that limits apply to all people rather than merely applying to disabled people who are often seen as being limited. None of us is divine, and every human being has to respond to the limits they encounter. The problems arise with a negative perception of some limits, such as my use of a wheelchair, while others are seen as insignificant, such as my short-sightedness. This approach does, however, make clear that there are no well-defined boundaries between disabled and non-disabled people. In these examples of disability theology, we can see that positive attempts have been made to improve the inclusion of disabled people in church communities. In particular, it has challenged the erroneous link between disability and sin, requiring forgiveness, and the assumption that disabled people need to be physically healed before they can participate fully in church communities. However, few of the writers pay serious attention to interpersonal relationships between disabled and non-disabled people, particularly physically disabled people. And of those that consider this relationship, it is left in generalized terms. Very few mention friendships, but they leave the nature of that relationship undeveloped. So we turn now to our Baptist context. Some of you may think I'm not. The change in our understanding of disability from characteristics of individuals to the relationships between people suggests we consider the importance of our relationship with the Trinitarian God and the nature of our covenant relationships with God and one another. Paul Fides, in his book Participating in God, explores the pastoral implications of a particular perspective on the relational Trinity. Two aspects of his work are particularly helpful in developing an understanding of covenant communities that enable the participatory inclusion of disabled people. First, the concept of persons as relations, and secondly, the importance of participation in the life of God and God's covenant relationships with all of creation. The first key characteristic of Fides's understanding of God as Trinity concerns relationality, particularly between persons. He writes, it is not human individual persons, but relations between them in all their diversity and depth that offers a helpful analogy to what we call divine persons. Fides proposes a shift of emphasis from persons in relation to persons as relation, which enables him to prioritize the centrality of relationships. If we speak not simply about an analogy between God and human beings, but also in terms of relationships, new possibilities begin to take shape. The models of social trinity and Fides Trinitarian theology are at root, of course, both relational. A clear focus on the nature of the relationships, however, is particularly helpful when it comes to focusing on relationships between disabled and non-disabled people. The other key characteristic is the concept of participation, of which he writes, the point of Trinitarian language is not to provide an example to copy, but to draw us into participation in God, out of which life can be transformed. But the language of Trinity certainly encourages the values of relationship, community, and mutuality between persons. It is about interdependence and not domination. This puts clear water between his understanding of God as Trinity and existing models of social Trinity, and his use of the term perichoresis is especially significant. The idea of perichoresis has been one of the ways, according to Dan Sutcliffe-Pratt, that theologians explore a relationship between God in eternity and God in salvation. It is an important tool for exploring threeness, how threeness actually works in the concept of the triune God. In a much quoted definition, Catherine Lacuna writes, perichoresis means being in one another, permeation without confusion. No person exists by him or herself, or is referred to him or herself. This would produce number and therefore division within God. Rather, to be a divine person is to be by nature in relation to other persons. This is certainly what those using the phrase persons in relationship suggest, and the term has been used by proponents of the social trinity. But it is use of persons as relation and participation in God takes the social trinity approach a stage further. The shift from persons in relationship to persons as relation enables us to leave behind any concerns about the personhood of disabled people, and there have been many of those over the years, and to focus instead on the relations that disabled people have with others. This is able to clarify this further using the metaphor of dance. When we think about dance, there is a tendency to focus on the dancers. When it comes to the divine dance, it suggests that the focus shifts to perichoretic movements in human life and not with the movers. This is helpful when considering the participatory inclusion of disabled people, because the focus shifts to their dynamic relationships with non-disabled people and to participation in the divine life. This uses the metaphor of dance to highlight broad differences between Eastern and Western ways of speaking about God as Trinity. The Eastern tradition emphasizes a dynamic relationality between the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. This lends itself to an image of an open, progressive dance in which God reaches out and draws us all into the relationships within God's Trinitarian life. The Western approach is more like a closed circle dance among equal participants. This distinction is clearly promising as a way into understanding the participatory inclusion of disabled people. The Western tradition takes us part of the way, emphasizing some elements of participation, equality, and reciprocity. If, however, we stay with the image of a circle dance, we may quickly see that this could introduce problems for our inclusion of disabled people. Circle dancers face inwards with a strong impetus to maintain the integrity of the circle at all times. If we were to think of a church community as an inward-facing circle, it would be relatively easy to exclude disabled people and others on the margins from participation in such a dance. If instead the dance is a progressive dance into which others are invited, then it becomes possible to imagine the life of the church as open to the inclusion of those on the margins. Today's Baptists have their roots back in the early 17th century, and for early Baptists, intentional and mutual covenant making formed a basis for the way they understood their relationships with God and fellow believers within and between particular local congregations. Baptist intentional rejection of the authority of the state church and recognition of the importance of the gathered church was a hallmark of early Baptist life. Mutual relationships with one another before God were key to the local gathered congregation. This was strengthened during the 17th century by the emergence of the much used metaphorical phrases of walking together and watching over one another. These phrases made clear what it meant to be in practice to be in a covenant community. The dynamic images conveyed by these phrases suggest a group of people journeying together and a people open to the future. This is emphasized by the third phrase, which completes the picture, in ways known and to be made known. The Baptist Church is not a group of individuals who simply happen to be walking together in the same direction, but a group of believers who are intentionally walking together with common purpose, sharing for and supporting one another on the journey, as a group of friends might. The purpose and direction of the journey they claim was not of their own choosing, but was in the Lord's ways, which they discerned together in church meetings. When Baptists met as a church, they did so intentionally, gathering together to seek the Lord's way. In this way, mutual covenant relationships became strengthened within and between congregations. The late 20th century saw renewed interest in the idea of covenant and the broader implications both within and beyond Baptist church communities. Paul Fides was one of the key voices in this debate that took place during that period within and among Baptist churches, associations, the Union, and in wider Baptist and ecumenical conversations. Andy Goodliffe, however, notes that despite Fides's influence, a theology of union as covenant failed to embed itself in the language and practice of the Union. Despite this, Fides' understanding of God as Trinity, especially the use of persons as relation and participation, enhances a Baptist covenant ecclesiology that enables the fostering of inclusive relationships with physically disabled people. An emphasis on God's desire for us to be drawn into the dance as participants and God's initiative in making covenant with all people is fundamental for the way participation is expressed in covenant communities. Such an emphasis is not unique to Fides' approach to God as Trinity, but his emphasis on persons as relation offers far-reaching implications for all relationships in God, and with each other. All the social, economical, and other barriers that exist between people are potentially broken down. Barriers of this kind were identified long ago in New Testament letters to both churches in Galatia and Colossae, to which we could now add barriers between disabled and non-disabled people. Francis Young says, within this community, there is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, black nor white, able-bodied and handicapped, sick. If our relationships with other people could be modeled on our potential for relationships with God, then the non-discriminatory characteristics of God's covenant initiative could impact us all. And as Fides is quick to point out, an appreciation of relationships within God as Trinity would also lead to a greater emphasis on mutuality. A new emphasis on mutual relations, inspired by this approach to God as Trinity, has the potential to address the asymmetric relationships that have become normal between disabled and non-disabled people, and the promise of new creative relationships can open up. Fides explores two dimensions of God's intentions for covenant relationships, the vertical and the horizontal. In some accounts, however, this has almost sounded like two distinct covenants. Such a separation would wrongly suggest a divide between God's covenant initiative with all creation and our covenant relationships with each other. This could lead to all sorts of unhelpful scenarios and seriously limit the way in which we understand God's desire to be in covenant with all people. If, for example, the reality on the ground is that disabled people are denied full covenant relationships with others in a church community, it is hard to separate this from the implication that God has different desires for relationships with disabled and non-disabled people. An understanding of covenant relationships that sees them as manifestations of God's covenant relationships with the world has potential to foster inclusion and participation well beyond the local church congregation. If congregations understand themselves being strong covenant relationships with others, the local association and the wider union of churches, then good practice concerning inclusion is more likely to be shared. Individuals are more likely to be encouraged to participate in wider church life. That was certainly my experience during the process of my testing the call to ministry 25 years ago. The church in which I was a member at the time had good relationships with other Baptist churches and the local association. This assisted the provision of opportunities for me to preach and lead services beyond the local congregation and facilitated my involvement in the local association life. Although the language of covenant was not widely used within that group, there is little doubt that my experience was a practical outworking of an open understanding of covenant relationships beyond the local congregation. In this final section, I want to suggest that friendship, understood in terms of being intentional, mutual, and particular, has the potential to foster participatory inclusion of physically disabled people in Baptist church communities. Within Baptist church communities, these friendships can be understood in terms of our covenant relationship with God, with one another, and the world. Friendships exist within a continuum of relationships, ranging from the most intimate to the most hostile. Sally McFague refers to this as the sliding definition of a friend. Hostile relationships, for example, between opposing members of a street gang, show no signs of friendship whatsoever. These would be described as highly distorted relationships that restrict the possibilities of personhood for the individual involved. Relationships that range from the intimacy of a long-term marriage to the more distant, casual and transitory provide different levels of intensity and inclusion between individuals and groups, which can be understood in terms of friendships. These are relationships that undistort the personhood of those involved. The idea of distorted and undistorted relationships and their impact on personhood is drawn from Alistair McFadden's The Called Personhood. For some time now, virtual friendships through social media have become commonplace and now need to be included within the continuum, though they stretch well beyond the scope of this paper and were not addressed in my thesis. There are three basic themes that have emerged in the long history of writing about the nature of friendships. There is a general agreement that friendships are good and beneficial for those involved, often by placing the good of the other before self. It has been recognized as important, however, that friendship should be reciprocal and mutual, with both self and other contributing and receiving from the friendship. There has been discussion about the relative merits of friendship between just two people and friendships that are more inclusive. Although friendships have often been thought of essentially private, they are able to be effective in the public realm. Friendships may differ if they are based on intrinsic or extrinsic factors. Friendships based on intrinsic factors such as mutual attraction or liking tend to require a level of similarity. Friendships grounded extrinsically in the acknowledgement of God's universal love, however, have the potential to enable relationships to form between people who have experienced significant differences. Friendship, recognized as an expression of God's universal love, seems to be the best way to nurture relationships between disabled and non-disabled people in the context of Baptist church communities. My hope would be that Baptist church communities can play a part in helping people move from highly distorted asymmetric relationships to less distorted mutual relationships. This should in turn enable people to move away from impersonal so-called I-it relationships towards more inclusive I-thou relationships. There are parallels between the shift of focus from the individual medical model to a social model and the formation of friendships. When people form friendships with others, the focus of attention moves from the self, often in isolation, the other, and the importance of the relationship. This resonates with a more general shift from centered self, a concept that has held considerable influence throughout the period we think of as modernity, towards the concept of decentered self, which has become more prevalent in late modernity. A core feature of the decentered self is a radical openness to the other, welcoming meaningful relationships that embrace difference rather than homogeneity. There are, however, risks in decentering. The most significant is an extreme individualism of the kind that denies interrelatedness. These can be mitigated within a Christian context if it is also understood that the shift away from self-centeredness can simultaneously be a shift towards Christ-centered self. This is a very different form of connected self, in which the self is understood in terms of being profoundly related and in real dialogue with one another. As Summers says, a relationship with the other is an integral part of the self, of who the self is. The specific characteristics of friendship have been much debated, but for the purposes of fostering the participatory inclusion of disabled people, I want to focus on three mentioned earlier. Firstly, such friendships need to be intentional in formation and in purpose. Friendships between disabled and non-disabled people need to be intentionally formed to overcome the perceived differences between people that tend to inhibit the formation of friendships. They also need to have the explicit purpose of including one another. This intentionality addresses the exclusion from relationships and participation that disabled people have historically experienced. I noted earlier that intentionality was also a feature of covenant making within and between Baptist church congregations. Secondly, these friendships need to be explicitly emphasized mutuality between disabled and non-disabled participants. This emphasis is important to challenge the experience of asymmetric relationships that assumed a carer cared for role for non-disabled and disabled people respectively. There is a long history of disabled people's lives being controlled by those in the medical and related professions. As noted earlier, there is evidence that this approach has led to impoverished pastoral care approach being taken towards disabled people within church communities. By emphasizing the mutuality of friendships, the contribution of each person, disabled and non-disabled, is valued as much as the benefit gained from receiving from the relationship. The focus on mutuality was also identified as a characteristic of Baptist understandings of covenant. Thirdly, these relationships are particular. This does not mean that they are exclusive friendships between particular people, but that they are friendships that take into account the particularity of the participants and their contexts. While the individual medical model overemphasized the individual, the social model overcompensated by focusing on the general relationships and the actions of wider society towards disabled people in general. The nature of disability is complex, and the experiences of disabled people are significantly influenced by many factors, as indicated earlier in this paper. Friendships have, I believe, the potential to take these multiple factors into account. This enables disabled and non-disabled people to seek participatory inclusion in their specific contexts in ways that may be very different for other contexts and other people. This is again a reflection of the emphasis among Baptists on the particular significance of a local congregation and its context. So in conclusion, one of the most significant reasons disabled people have historically been excluded from society and church communities has been the dominance of the individual medical model of disability. This located the problem of disability within individuals and required them to change or be cured in order to participate in society or in church. If this was not possible, they were institutionalized or viewed as passive recipients of pastoral care. The change in understanding of disability brought about by the development of the social model in the late 20th century located the problem of disability with social attitudes and actions towards disability. This change facilitated greater inclusion, but largely ignored the importance of interpersonal relationships. It has also underpinned a significant growth in diverse theological explorations of disability. By focusing on relations within the Trinity and our participatory covenant relationship with God and others, the nature of relations between disabled and non-disabled people comes to the fore. If these are understood in terms of friendships, which are intentional, mutual, and particular, then there is the potential to foster greater participatory inclusion within Baptist church communities locally, within association life, that of Baptists together and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin, and hopefully you can now see us all applauding and showing our appreciation to you for such a rich and stimulating conversation starter on this really important topic. So thank you immensely for that. I just encourage people to now type some questions for Martin in the chat. I wonder whether while people are gathering their thoughts, I could kick off by asking you to reflect more generically on the kind of Baptist branding, if you like. I mean, I noticed that many of your conversation partners earlier in the presentation were outside of the Baptist context, and I just wondered whether do you feel that there's a significant commonality with disability work that's going on in the Church of England and in other denominations, or is this kind of focus that you're bringing to us today distinctively Baptist in the way that it can be implemented?
The answer is yes and no. One of the questions that I faced was when exploring the subject in the early stages of my research was that I obviously needed to put a scope around my thesis. The Baptist Further Studies Fund has been very helpful in funding some of my studies, and my own experience as a Baptist minister and my understanding of Baptist theology already indicated, when the importance of relationships emerged, that within Baptist church communities we had a framework which was very conducive to developing this argument. However, I do think it can go beyond the Baptist church communities. I haven't made much progress on writing my thesis into a book. I have had conversations with a friend who is an editor within the Christian book world, and their strong suggestion is that if I want to shift more than a few dozen copies, I will have to quite de-Baptist my thesis to make it applicable, or more easily applicable, within the wider community. So I'm aware of those issues. It certainly is not exclusive to Baptist church communities, but the context was, I think, particularly conducive to the exploration I've undertaken.
That's really helpful. Thank you for the clarification there. Helen Cameron, would you like to unmute and ask your question, please?
Thank you, Martin, for your reflections, and congratulations on your doctorate. And I do hope you managed to get publication. The prejudice you've just articulated on part of publishers is one I've come across, and I'm sorry to hear that that's something you're encountering. My question really comes from the experience in Project Violet of asking Baptists Together for information about ministers, so that we can ensure that the project addresses issues of intersectionality, and finding that no information is collected about whether ministers have a disability or a long-term health condition. And so what that fed into is when you were talking about the importance of particular friendships and of people knowing us as we truly are. A frequent comment that's made about the emphasis on the local in Baptist life is that some ministers feel quite isolated and unwilling to give themselves to those kind of friendships within the local church life because of the distinctive role which they have within the local church. And I just wondered whether that's something you reflected on, either from that point of view, or the sort of initial justice issue which I raised about a paucity of information.
I haven't reflected on it in great detail, specific to disability and relationships. When I stepped out of pastoral ministry, it's 8 years ago now, to begin my long journey to my PhD, I was part of a well-functioning face-to-face ministers group, varying levels of participation, but we met on a monthly basis. I'm aware that that hasn't happened during lockdown, and I'm aware that where I'm moving to in Southampton, they haven't restarted the face-to-face meeting. And as a minister going into a new area with a very low level of understanding of the communities around and the churches around, I think that does raise the risk of isolation. Fortunately, technology such as this can ameliorate that to a certain extent. That's the limit of my reflection. Specific to relationships, sorry, no, that wasn't. Sorry, I glanced at a question, and it wasn't you who asked the question about other forms of disability. Does that answer your question, Helen, or do you want to come back to me?
I think that's helpful. I can't ask you to reflect on something you haven't reflected on. I just wondered whether that had come up in your in the work that you've done so far. And I don't know whether you have any comment on how you feel about the collection of data on disability as one of the dimensions of justice which is important to Baptist Together.
I think it could be a very useful thing to do, certainly. It needs to be done with care and also an awareness of the willingness and also ability to self-identify as disabled. For instance, I don't identify myself primarily as a disabled person.
Sure.
I am fortunate in some ways in that my use of a wheelchair is pretty obvious, not so much on Zoom or on Facebook, but in real life it is the first thing that people see. Conversely, that is a problem. There is a feature known in sociology as the focusing illusion, where when we meet somebody who we don't know, we focus instantly on the most obvious difference between us. And for most people, that is my use of a wheelchair. And that becomes the dominating definition. There are many people within our constituency for whom their disability, their impairment is less obvious. When I was serving on Baptist Union Council, it was during the period where we reduced the size of council and tried to make it more representational. And that meant that about 8 people needed to identify or be identified as disabled people. That wasn't the case when I served on council. And that was partly because I noticed that there were a number of older participants in council who, because of their significant loss of hearing or struggles with mobility, might be identified as disabled people, although they did not identify themselves as disabled people. So you may find in the collection of such data that people are unwilling to do so, or they just don't self-identify. That's one of the problems of the minority group model approach to disability, is that it requires people to self-identify as disabled people.
Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. Ed, would you like to unmute and ask your question, please?
Thank you very much for your paper. It was very interesting.
We're struggling to hear you a bit, Ed. If you could just speak up a bit.
How's this? Can you hear me now?
Not very well. Can you maybe sit closer to the microphone?
How about now?
Go ahead with the question, and I'll repeat if necessary.
Okay, sorry. So my question is, as someone with a specific level of
I'm really sorry, Ed. We really can't hear you at all. I don't think anyone... Can anyone else hear? Shall we just go with the question as it's posed in the chat? Is that best? So Ed's the person that was asking about hidden forms of disability such as autism and whether your model applies to those kinds of disabilities.
Thank you. It has been raised before, and her name escapes me, a lady I mentioned who's done some research into the inclusion of disabled people in a wider ecumenical setting. She does mention friendship and notes that it is not a panacea, and I explicitly state that in the conclusion of my own thesis, because there are groups of people, groups of disabled people for whom relationships are, I don't like the word used challenging, but sorry, I apologize, that probably inappropriate phrase comes to mind. And I know one or two autistic people, and they would struggle with the forming of the relationships that I'm suggesting. So I'm not suggesting that it's a panacea for everybody. What I am suggesting is that it is an additional tool to use alongside some of the other approaches to the inclusion of disabled people. What I've done is friendship is used very closely with people with learning disabilities, building on Jean Vanier's work and others, and Hans Reinder's Received the Gift of Friendship. For some reason, that focus on friendship hasn't crossed to be applied to physically disabled people. I suspect it's because there's been a naive assumption that disabled people form relationships with non-disabled people in the way that non-disabled people form relationships with one another. There is some research out there that indicates that that's not the case. Does that address Ed's question? You'd like to nod if I've addressed it. If you want to follow up, stick it in the chat and we'll take it direct from the chat.
Yeah, I think there's an indication that that's all good. I wondered that there are no more questions waiting in the chat at present. I did invite, I know some colleagues have got problems in terms of if you're using an iPad, actually using the chat. So I have invited a couple of people to just unmute if they would like to ask a question at this point. I mean, perhaps again, whilst people are gathering their thoughts, I just wondered whether the in your sorry, Paul Fiddis has got a question. Paul, would you like to unmute and ask your question now, please?
Yes, thank you. It's a very basic question, but first of all, I did want to thank Martin so much for his paper and the very imaginative, constructive way that he took up some ideas of mine and orientated them towards this question of disability, where I found absolutely illuminating, and I'd really like some future conversation with him about it, but that's just for a preliminary. It's about the word disability itself, because Martin did indicate that that tends to mean that someone doesn't have something that the social role requires, as it were. So someone is seen to be missing something rather than actually having a unique contribution to make. And I just wondered if, on the other hand, Martin did seem quite comfortable in using the word disabled and disability. Is this because there really isn't any other adequate word? Or because though I do find it uncomfortable using the word myself, really, but I don't really know what else to use. Differently abled, I do find a bit sort of clunky and perhaps has all sorts of pejorative associations with it. So could you just help us really, Martin, about
certainly
what sort of words we should be using?
There is no consensus, I'm afraid, Paul, which makes life rather challenging. There is, however, consensus on inappropriate language. So what is a struggle, for instance, if you're reading Hawass, is the repetitive use of handicap and handicapped, which I've heard he was reluctant to change, to modify. In the States, until recently, the term handicap was the common phrase to use. And other language that is considered exclusionary and dated. However, it is, along with other language, being readopted by some disabled people. So if I call myself a cripple, then that's okay. And if somebody else who's not disabled calls me a cripple, it's not okay. On the language of disability, it's a chunk of my thesis, which I will let you read at some point, Paul. There is no consensus. In the UK, we've tended to use the language of disabled people or disabled person, and just the word disabled. In the US and in other places, people first language has tended to be used. So person with a disability, person with a learning disability. I personally have a slight issue with that, in that it seems to infer a possessive. So I would be a person with a disability, which seems to rather strongly echo having a person with an impairment. Proponents of people first language would strongly disagree with that. I would use the term disability and disabled person because it's in common parlance. The struggle comes when its understanding is blurred by the overhang of the medical model, where it refers to something individual, characteristic, and the contemporary proper usage of it when it refers to the social model labeling of the discrimination that I experience, I and other disabled people, and therefore the lack of opportunity and inclusion. I mean, yes, and the word itself is problematic because, as you pointed out, it can infer the inability. You can understand it as, in effect, as a one-word metaphor, and certainly the prefix of dis is troubling to some writers. I don't want to police language. My aim would be to get people to think about the language that they use and we use. For instance, when you ask people to stand in church, please remember that not everybody can stand. Please stand if you're willing and able is a helpful phrase. But no, I certainly don't want to lay the rules down. I want to get people to think about the language that is used.
Thank you. Perhaps I could say in my mind, seems a difference between saying someone is disabled and that they have a disability. If you say someone has a disability, it seems to me it's like saying that they've got something missing or they have a handicap. To say someone's disabled, to me, usually means they've been disabled by others. You know,
yes.
It's a social attitude that has disabled them. Would you think there might be a difference between
depending on the context? There's a very subtle difference between someone who is disabled and a person. Between someone who is and those who are disabled.
Yeah.
I think I've explored that elsewhere.
That's very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Paul. Wesley Scott had his hand raised, and I wonder if you'd like to unmute and ask your question, please.
It's not really a question, it's an observation, just to say that I also have a PhD and my research is in design, but there are some similarities. People will often, I found doing my research, I had a big chunk on language in my PhD, and often I found that disabled people will label themselves how they want to be labelled. So some are comfortable with being called disabled, others are not comfortable with it. So it's always best to ask the person that you're working with or the group of people that you're working with before you start referring to them as anything that might offend them.
Thank you.
Can I just comment, Wes, on your comment in the chat about your experience, interestingly, in Coventry with an Anglican setup. From my limited awareness of the Anglican setup, actually you could argue with all churches, there has been an unquestioned adoption of the medical model of disability by many churches. And only when churches start thinking about the implications of inclusion of disabled people do they tend to wake up to that and move towards a social model. Also, I do wonder whether the Church of England, being an institution and the way it is structured and having policies, tends to focus on that. Although when I was still in Coventry, I was aware that within the Anglican setup, if you were disabled and quite suitably qualified and experienced, you would be guaranteed at least an interview, which gets you into the room. My struggle with the Baptist ways of doing settlement is that it is sometimes extremely difficult to get into the room with the diaconate or the search committee.
I was just going to say, I think we've met a long time ago, but I think we have met because I spoke to you, I think.
We may have done, Wes, yes.
Thank you. I had two follow-up questions while people are typing further comments in the chat. One of which was just an observation in terms of how geography also matters. And here I'm just reflecting on my experiences living in India for 6 months, where my host's brother was disabled and was physically locked away because it was regarded as not acceptable to in Serampore at that time. This person had to be, kept away from mainstream society, and so obviously this is some time ago, but it brought, it was certainly not the attitude to disability that one experienced in the UK at that same time. And so I think it brought home to me just the very stark differences according to geographical location. And then the second thing was really to follow up on Ed's point about using friendship as a kind of tool, if you like, or a way into breaking down barriers, because a lack of ability to make friends is regarded as a key criterion for identifying people with autism. And so in the sort of screening process that, this is commonly picked up on as, and in kind of conversation forums, parents lamenting the fact that their children have not got friendship groups in the same way that their peers have. So I just wonder whether there's a kind of alienation of a particular category by using friendship as a tool.
I'll pick up on that one first while I remember, and then go back to the context one. Yeah, I mean the friendship approach will not be a panacea. But I wouldn't want to use it as describe it as an alienation of one group of disabled people. It may not directly address all groups of disabled people who are very, very diverse. But even with people who are autistic, I think we can be friendly, even if that friendship is not reciprocated in the way that it would be reciprocated with others. My own experience is that the girl that I know at church who is significantly autistic, very high functioning, I will always say hello to her and get some sort of response. And that is noted by her parents, that some of the church, and actually our church in general, is much more inclusive and friendly towards her and open to her inclusion in church in an appropriate way. So, does that answer, Christine? I'm aware of the limits of it. I'm certainly not arguing that this is the new way to foster inclusion of disabled people and wave a magic wand and it all gets better. On the context, yes, context is extremely important. I have some limited experience of Albania. My in-laws were missionaries in the 90s. Journeying to Albania was, let's say, a challenge. Not just the physical challenge, but also the cultural. They had gone through a period where, again, as you mentioned, disabled children were hidden away. A friend did some research looking at the discrepancy between birth records and school records, and most of the difference was explained by disabled babies not being then encouraged to go to school when they reached the schooling age. There was also a very strong reflection of cultural attitudes. They were horrified that my in-laws had let their daughter marry a disabled person. This was Christians in the opening up country. And for quite some time, they were very insistent on knowing whether I'd been healed that week as a result of their prayers, to the point we had to ask my in-laws to just not ask the question anymore. They would know if I was going to be physically healed. They would be the first to know. But it was a troubling, persistent question. And in, again, the physicality of the new situation when we move house, the manse is having to have building work done on it. The road outside is unadopted. That will cause challenges in the longer term. The context of living in a new city and not knowing where things are is a challenge for everybody. But when you're a wheelchair user, the challenge is somewhat exacerbated.
Yeah, thank you for that, Martin. I think Christine Hutt has got her hand up. Christine, would you like to unmute?
Yeah. About 6 years ago, I was diagnosed with age-related hearing loss, and I didn't immediately think of myself as disabled, but I had for some years, a few years before that, I'd been helping with the Disabled Christian Fellowship. That showed me that disability is a wide range of, covers a wide range of things and a wide range of people with different personalities. But it was when I went there the first time with my hearing loss, I felt like I was one of them, which was strange. But the other thing is, I've now got a disabled person's rail card. Now, I didn't find out about that from the hospital or my GP, but when I went to lip reading classes, I found all sorts of useful information, which told me I could then apply for a disabled person's rail card. So it's, you know, it's been a learning curve for me, and it's been quite challenging during the time of mask wearing and, you know, completely, you know, and so.
I mean, I think it's important that as we think about disability and disability inclusion, and possibly today's low attendance, I realise there are college issues at the moment, Christine, from Regents, but other people participating, I have found that when I'm talking about disability, the attendance tends to be lower than the average at similar events. But certainly I think churches could facilitate the inclusion of disabled people in wider society as well, and not just within the community. So just as we've addressed issues of food poverty with being active in food banks, I see no reason why churches shouldn't. In fact, I would have thought there's a very good reason for them to become active in providing links to that sort of information and resource, particularly as there are many people like yourself who become significantly deaf, or their sight deteriorates to a significant impact, and they don't have the contacts within the right communities to find out that information. And I think would be helpful to churches to at least be able to signpost that sort of thing. I mean, because I was raised within a family and in mainstream education, I've actually missed out on quite a lot of the disability support stuff that I could have received, I would have received, had I been in what's unhelpfully called special education, segregated education. I certainly wouldn't have got to college. The other context, going back to Christine's comment about context, Paul, you may remember meeting me many, many years ago in mid-90s at Regents. And I have to say, one of the reasons I didn't apply to a dominant reason for not applying to Regents at the time was the physicality of both Regent's Park College and also the challenge of getting around Oxford in order to participate in church and university life. And one of the reasons why I chose Bristol was, although Brian will remember that the access was not brilliant, it was an awful lot better than some of the other places.
Yeah. I think the other thing about disability for me is, having worked with disabled people, I'm more aware of their needs and I'm more comfortable around them than I was at one time. So I think that's another thing about developing friendships is that being comfortable, interacting with people, and because for many years people have been shut away and not actually visible. And I think now that they are visible, it's much healthier, and we can develop normal relationships. I think that needs to be encouraged.
Yeah.
Can I just ask one final reflection? I'm aware that time's ticking on and we'll need to come to a close soon, but I'd be curious, because you kind of mentioned it in passing, the whole Zoom scenario, and I'm not wanting you to comment on the friendship aspect, the social media aspect, which was, I think, the context in which you mentioned Zoom. But I know from Dr. Ellie McLaughlin's work, where she was looking in the early stages of the pandemic at the benefits that Zoom Church brought for the inclusion of disabled worshippers to participate in church, that was something that was very beneficial. And I just wondered what your thoughts are at this particular juncture in terms of churches making decisions whether to continue hybrid or whether to just go back to worshipping in person. And again, perhaps even with your own context in mind in Southampton, as to what you envision for that place.
Okay. The debate is quite hot, shall we say, and is somewhat polarized. The disabled community, and also older people, and for those with other reasons for struggling to return on a Sunday morning, are very much in favour of the continuation of some form of hybrid church. And the churches, as far as I can tell, who are most emphatic that this should stop, that it isn't appropriate church, are those that have very limited experience of inclusion of people with disabilities. They can't see the problem. Some of the discussions I've been on the edge of, and I haven't entered into them because it would put the steam coming out of my ears, they just don't get the implication. We've had a discussion at Dunchurch, where I'm in membership, which was quite impassioned, and has, as long as we are able to technically and resource it, and as long as there is a need, and there still is a need, we will continue with some form of hybrid. The church that I'm going to in Swathling, they're not technically very well equipped, either with people with knowledge or with equipment. They've done a very basic Zoom church. When I preached with a peak and with a view, there was a mobile phone on a stand in front of me, positioned so that over my shoulder they could just about read the words of the projected songs. When I visited since, that wasn't being done for that service, because the one person who had been relying on Zoom was finally present in the community because they'd had their booster jab. So I think it is important that we find some way of continuing that inclusion. Disabled people's argument is that for years and years we kept asking to be included, and we were told it wasn't possible. Suddenly, with the pandemic, what you told us you couldn't do, you managed to do in 7 or 14 days. And now you're turning around and threatening to withdraw it again. That's the strength of feeling that engenders. And I think it would be completely inappropriate for churches to intentionally exclude members of their community from this and other technical means of technological means of inclusion. It's been wonderful for some people.
Thank you. That was a really helpful contribution. Well, I'd like to express on behalf of everyone present just how grateful we are to you for giving us this really practical and impactful focus in ways in which we can develop inclusivity towards disabled people in our own communities. And perhaps you would join me in applauding Martin and thanking him for his presentation today.
Thank you for the opportunity.